The rain had been falling for hours that night, the kind of relentless rain that seemed to wash away footprints, memories, and sometimes even entire lives. The hospital's dim corridors smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Nurses moved quickly, machines beeped softly, and in a corner room, a newborn baby cried into the cold silence of the world. On a small metal crib beside her lay a folded blanket, a tiny note, and nothing else. No name, no address, no explanation. Just a life left behind. For years, no one knew the truth about that night, until one simple question from a curious young woman would unlock a story so powerful that it would leave everyone who heard it stunned. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet heroes who walk among us every day, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like this reach more hearts around the world. 17 years had passed since that rainy night. The baby had grown into a thoughtful young woman named Emily Carter, known among her friends for her curiosity and kindness. But despite her cheerful nature, Emily carried a quiet question in her heart that had never been answered. She had grown up in foster care after being found in that hospital room. The nurses had named her Emily because they said her eyes looked like spring skies after rain. She had never known her parents. She had never known why she had been left behind. The only thing that remained from that night was the small note. The paper had aged and turned yellow, but the words were still clear. Please take care of her. She deserves a better life than I can give. There was no signature, no name. For years, Emily wondered about that sentence. Who had written it? Was it her mother, her father, someone who loved her, or someone who simply walked away? Her life had not been easy, but she had always refused to let bitterness take root in her heart. She worked hard in school, volunteered at shelters, and eventually began working part-time at a small community library while studying social work at college. She believed that every person had a story, and one day she decided she wanted to find hers. The search began quietly. Hospital records, old newspapers, archived reports. Most people would have given up long ago, but Emily had patience. She spent months piecing together small fragments of information. Eventually, one detail surfaced. The nurse who had discovered her that night had written a note in the hospital record. She remembered seeing a man leaving the hallway shortly before the baby was found. He had been soaked from the rain, wearing a worn leather jacket and holding something close to his chest. But when the nurse returned minutes later, he was gone. For years, the identity of that man had remained a mystery, until Emily found a name connected to a nearby security camera report from that night. Daniel Hayes. There was no clear proof, but the record showed that a man by that name had been briefly admitted to the emergency room earlier that evening for minor injuries before disappearing from the hospital. Emily's heart pounded when she found the record. Something about the story felt incomplete. Why would someone leave a baby but also seek medical help that same night? Determined to learn the truth, she tracked down the last known address linked to Daniel Hayes. It led her to a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, where small houses sat beneath tall maple trees. The paint on the houses had faded over time, but flowers grew along the sidewalks, and children's bicycles leaned against fences. At the end of the street stood a modest home, with a small garden full of sunflowers. Emily stood outside the gate for several minutes, unsure if she should knock. Then the front door opened. A man stepped out, carrying a small backpack and holding the hand of a little boy, maybe 6 years old. The man's hair was streaked with gray, and his face showed the quiet weariness of someone who had lived through many long nights. Yet there was something gentle in his eyes. Emily knew instantly. This was Daniel Hayes, the man who might hold the answer to the question she had carried her entire life. Days passed before she found the courage to return. When she finally knocked on the door, Daniel opened it slowly, confusion flickering across his face. Emily introduced herself carefully, explaining that she was researching an old hospital record. At first, Daniel seemed calm. But the moment she mentioned the rainy night 17 years ago, something changed in his expression. It was as if the past had suddenly stepped back into the room. Emily hesitated, then asked the question she had carried for her entire life. Why had someone left a baby in that hospital room without even writing their name? Daniel stared at the floor for a long moment. Then he asked her something that made her heart race. He asked her what her name was. When she answered Emily Carter, his hands began to tremble. The silence between them grew heavy, and finally she asked the question that would change everything. Why did you leave without your name? The answer she expected was simple. Fear, shame, responsibility avoided. But the truth Daniel Hayes revealed that afternoon would shock her more than anything she had imagined. 17 years earlier, Daniel had not been running away. He had been running toward help. On that same rainy night, his wife Laura Hayes had gone into sudden labor weeks before her due date. They had rushed toward the hospital through a violent storm. The roads were flooded, the car nearly slid off the highway, and panic filled every second. But tragedy struck before they reached the hospital. Laura collapsed inside the car. By the time Daniel carried her through the hospital doors, doctors realized something was terribly wrong. Complications had caused severe internal bleeding. Within minutes, doctors were forced to perform an emergency procedure. Laura didn't survive. The baby did. Emily. Daniel's voice trembled as he explained what happened next. He had been injured during the frantic drive and briefly treated in the emergency room while doctors fought to save Laura. When they finally told him she was gone, something inside him shattered. He was 23 years old, no family nearby, no job, no home stable enough for a newborn. He had already been struggling financially before the tragedy. The hospital bills alone would have buried him in debt. But the real reason he left without his name was even more heartbreaking. He had overheard a nurse discussing adoption services and safe surrender laws that could protect the baby. In that moment of overwhelming grief and fear, Daniel believed the hospital could give the child a better future than he ever could. He wrote the note with shaking hands. He stayed in the hallway for nearly 10 minutes afterward, unable to walk away. Then he heard the baby cry, and he ran. Not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her enough to believe someone else could give her more. Emily stood frozen as the story unfolded. All her life she had imagined abandonment, but what she discovered instead was sacrifice. Daniel continued speaking softly. After leaving the hospital that night, he spent years trying to rebuild his life. He worked multiple jobs, eventually starting a small landscaping business. He carried the memory of that night every single day. He never tried to find the baby because he believed it would only disrupt her life, and because he thought she deserved a clean beginning. Emily's voice trembled as she asked one final question. If he loved her so much, why keep the truth hidden forever? Daniel looked at the small boy playing with toy trucks on the living room floor. His son. Daniel had remarried years later and built a quiet life. But he had never stopped wondering about the daughter he had lost to the world. He simply believed she deserved better than the broken man he had been. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she realized the truth that had been hidden for 17 years. She had not been abandoned by someone who didn't care. She had been given away by someone who cared so deeply that he sacrificed the chance to know her. The silence between them was heavy, emotional, almost overwhelming. And then something unexpected happened. The little boy looked up and asked Daniel who the visitor was. Daniel hesitated. Emily answered softly before he could speak. She said she might be family. Before we reach the ending of this powerful story, pause for a moment and write something in the comments. If you believe that love sometimes hides behind the hardest decisions, type the word hope. Years of unanswered questions finally settled in Emily's heart, like rain easing into calm water. She realized that the man standing before her had carried guilt and grief longer than she had carried curiosity. The two of them sat together for hours that afternoon, sharing memories neither of them had been able to speak aloud for years. For the first time, the story of that rainy night was complete. And it wasn't a story about abandonment. It was a story about love making the most painful choice imaginable. Before this story ends, if it touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in compassion and second chances, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us how this story made you feel. Your support helps these stories reach people who might need hope today. Because sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones hidden behind silence, waiting years for a single question brave enough to ask.